nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Shri Radhika prananatha pada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasya dattam tam Shri Gurum bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Mudakelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripakrite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupo Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adananastrinam dantoir yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chinta Malisapti Sangsto Durdantamadzvantahai Churastam Raganugami bhajano lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya sahasara smaratam brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasame Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatupada Padme Ya Bhakti Nikhilartha Varga Janani Ya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Pradavishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramana Parambuja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakur Yat Brajalokavat Gurutara Prem Naiva Tasyai Namah Yaram Ya Nikila Ghashanga Shamani Shrotra Tritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Acaryas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on this earth, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali. And we resume, now having in our last class entered this section on Sotsukya Prarthana, or Bhaktas, prayers full of eagerness. And as we discussed last time, Rupa Goswami defined, or rather Jiva Gosvami in his commentary on the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, defined eagerness as the feeling of being unable to pass the time. And as we mentioned, this is, definition by way of a tatastha lakshana, meaning there's such an intense urgency felt for the fulfillment of one's desire that it's difficult to pass time. So bhaktas having difficulty to pass eternity out of their longing for Krishna, out of longing to feel his presence within their hearts, to have his darshan, to relish his madhurya, to exchange affection with him, to render service to him, to satisfy him, so on and so forth. These various forms of desire that are said to melt the heart by Rupa Goswami in the definition of bhava in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Prayers expressive of such desire and the eagerness that emerges from it. This is what we're discussing now. So we'll come now to further installments in this vein. So we start with another verse of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. So I'm starting from verse 90 at the top of the file. Next, the compiler cites another prayer full of eagerness for Sri Krishna to manifest in the heart. Lavamritavanya madhurima lahari paripaka karuṇyānāṁ hṛdayaṁ kapaṭa-kiśoraḥ parisphuratu. May he, who is the apogee of the waves, of the sweetness, of a flood, of the nectar, of loveliness, the crafty adolescent, appear in the hearts of the recipients of his compassion. So, loveliness compared to nectar, that nectar flowing in a flood, the sweetness that can be experienced in that nectar, the waves carrying that sweetness, the peak of those waves, the apogee of those waves, this is Krishna. So I can say as a lad who grew up on the Pacific coast and watched the waves come in on the ocean so many times as a kid, this is a particularly charming description. Just in the hometown where I grew up, I could walk from my house to a world-famous surf break, which is called Mavericks, which is some of the biggest waves in the world, or at least at some time was famous for having some of the biggest waves in the world. And sometimes they would come in only a few days of the year during heavy winter storms, and sometimes we would walk out during the heavy rain to this point that took it was about a mile hike out to this point, and you could see these incredible, massive waves coming in. It was like a vibhuti described in the 10th chapter of the Gita, like one of the wonders of the world, or the great powers of nature, to see these massive, 40, 60, 70 foot waves billowing towards the shore. So to say that, this is not just some stormy salt water on a cold winter day, but to say that loveliness, which is relishable like nectar, is flooding towards oneself, and the sweetness that's found in those waves, the peak of that is what we could compare what it's like to have darshan of Krishna. Then this is a wonderful description. Perhaps Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, residing in Puridam on the bank of the Indian Ocean, was inspired by the sight of the waves coming in from the sea to poetically depict Krishna in this way. Whatever the case may be, the prayer is that Krishna, the essence of loveliness, who is a crafty adolescent, so this is hinting at the idea that the suggested meaning is that this apogee of his sweetness comes about in the midst of him exerting his clever play as an adolescent. So the hinted sense is that in the context of his lila with the gopis, in the midst of his trysts and secret rendezvous and semi-charming, semi-tricky behavior, that therein comes out this incredible sweetness. So may that appear in the hearts of those whom he blesses, or those who receive his compassion. So we'll add a few other points of reference for this verse, and that needs italics. In Srimad Bhagavatam, A similar description of Sri Krishna as, quote, the essence of loveliness, or lavanya saram, is spoken by the ladies of Mathura when they first behold him entering the city and marvel at the fortune of the gopis of Braja, who had the fortune of seeing and sporting with Sri Krishna daily throughout their youth. So this is a statement which Mahaprabhu also cites in the midst of his absorption in Krishna's Madhurya in the midst of his teachings to Sanatana Gosvami, which comes out in Madhya 21. So they say, Gopyas tapakimacharan yadamushya rupam lavanya saramasamordvam ananya siddham drigbir pibantyanusava bhinavam durapam akanta dhama yashasa shriya aishwarasya. What austerity did the gopis perform, as a result of which they drink through their eyes his form, which is the essence of loveliness, unequaled and unsurpassed, not accomplished otherwise, new at every moment, difficult to attain, and the ultimate reservoir of fame, splendor, and mastery. So they're just getting their first sight of Krishna, and it's so wonderful that they think, how fortunate are these people that saw him every day and got to see him up close and got to sport with him personally. That fortune is even greater. So as it's customary, especially for women folk the society of this literature, to engage in the observation of various rites which are thought to evoke certain beneficial results in a future life or in the time in the future, then they're thinking, what vrata do we have to do to get that? The way the gopis performed the Katyayani vrata with the hope of achieving Krishna as their husband and so on. So these ladies of Mathura are thinking, what vrata did these gopis do? How did they get this privilege? And the other implied sense is that we're ready to take on whatever hardship is necessary to experience that wonder of wonders. But anyway, the specific parallel between the citation and the verse is the description of using the word lavanya, which is central to the verse we're discussing now. So they also refer to him or speak of him as this essence of loveliness, which is what this more elaborate statement of the apogee, of the waves, of the sweetness, of the flood, of the nectar, of the loveliness was spoken of by Sarvabhauma. So what specifically do we mean by loveliness, or lavanya? Rupa Goswami has a definition of this in the Ujjal Nilamani. Quote, that which shines from within the limbs, like the waviness of luster within pearls, is here called loveliness. So, as pearls, when light plays upon them, they have a somewhat mild but rich sheen and shimmering, that they are waviness of luster. You could crunch that into one word and just say shimmering, or luminescence, perhaps, if you like. So the word lavanya is specific to that. So, as we've discussed many times, words like madhurya, sundarya, lavanya, according to Sanskrit koshas, are all synonymous, just as words like beauty and loveliness are essentially synonymous in English. So Rupa Goswami gives specific definitions for these terms to differentiate what they refer to in order to more vividly describe Sri Krishna. So, as we've discussed in the past, loveliness here essentially refers to the play of light that emerges from Krishna's figure, whereas Sundarya, or beauty, is more specifically the apt relative proportionality and curvature of all of his bodily features, which also comes from another definition in the Ujjal Nilamani. and so on. So what this also personally reminds me of, if I can go back to my days looking at the Pacific Ocean, is sometimes on certain days when the cloud cover was very light but somewhat present and the ocean was not too turbulent, then you would get the appearance of something that surfers would call glassy. And there would be a certain, when the waves were crisp and relatively fast moving, but yet there wasn't a lot of white water or excessive turbulence from wind. In other words, when there was low wind but a high swell and a clear sky, you would get these conditions that they would call glassy, in which the play of the sunlight off of the water would create quite bright, moving, reflections, or quite moving, like attractively moving beams of light going across the moving water, so to speak. So the water would be moving, and then there would be a counterplay of the light playing across the moving water. So it's especially beautiful way of seeing the ocean. So to say here that this, quote, waviness of luster within pearls, when that shines within his limbs, then to say that there's this play of light emerging out of his limbs is somewhat akin to that glassy appearance of the ocean. So my 2 cents would be that by choosing to use this word loveliness and also doing so in the context of a metaphor of a flood and waves, I'm inclined to think that our poet here, Sarvabhauma, had in mind something of the way that light plays upon moving water to create that shimmering effect. But that's just me, or that's the way I'm inclined to see the verse. In any case, the main point is that he's, in his mind's eye, envisioning the beauty of Krishna's figure, which is, emitting charming luminescence in, bright, vivid degree. So, the author's description of Sri Krishna as, quote, he who is the apogee of the waves, of the sweetness, of a flood, of the nectar, of loveliness, implies that loveliness, or lavanyam, that is, the attractive shimmering observable in a person's figure, is comparable to nectar, because it is greatly relishable. And Sri Krishna's figure exhibits such a profusion of superlative loveliness that it can only be compared to the apogee of the waves of pure sweetness that would emerge if the, quote, nectar of loveliness were to amass to such a vast quantity that it could not but begin to rush forth as a flood. So, coming to the second half of the verse, the author again describes Sri Krishna as, quote, crafty or kapaṭ, in the verse under discussion, just as he did in his verse which was cited earlier in Padyavali 72. So earlier, we had another verse where Sarvabhauma also used this same way of describing Krishna. And as we discussed there, the commentator gave a rather peculiar interpretation of the word kapaṭ there as being not an adjective describing Krishna, but rather he interprets it as a possessive compound in which the kapaṭ refers to Shishupal and others who were observers of Krishna. But as I mentioned, Ananda Gopal Shastri, as well as other interpreters of the Padyavali, didn't follow the Sanskrit commentator's interpretation in that case, and I also prefer other ways of reading it. So, interestingly, when Sarvabhauma again uses the word kapaṭ here, even the Sanskrit commentator doesn't give that meaning again in this case, because it is even less likely to fit here than it would in the other verse. So rather, in this case, the commentator considers Sri Krishna's, quote, craftiness to refer only to his childishness. Though, as was explained previously in the commentary on verse 72, Sri Krishna's craftiness in this case can also be understood to refer to the various means he employs in the course of sporting with Sri Radha and the other gopis of Braja for the sake of relishing parakiya rasa. Since Sri Krishna is described as adolescent or kishore in this verse, and his relishing of madhura rasa is most prominent during this age. So as Rupa Goswami observes, Vatsalya rasa is predominant in Balya, or Krishna's earliest age. Sakya rasa is predominant in the middle of Krishna's childhood, what is called Poganda. And Madhura rasa is most prominent in Krishna's Kaishora period, or his adolescence. So if Krishna is being described here as kapaṭa-kiśoraḥ, which is quite a name, then why would we not interpret kapat as being somehow referent to activities that are predominant within the age of Kaishor? That would be quite natural. To simply consider this kapaṭata to be childishness is possible, but it seems more likely that it would be apt to interpret it within the context of his adolescence specifically. So that's consistent with the previous way that he used the word in the previous verse in verse 72, and it also fits here. Therefore, I'm giving all of this in addition to what the commentator said. The compiler describes the enchanting nature of Sri Krishna at the peak of his adolescence as follows. So in the Sindhu, there's further subdivision of these ages of Krishna into the three parts of the Kaishor period, or his adolescence is described as the beginning, the middle, and then the height, or the final period. And that to depict that final period of Krishna's adolescence, then he writes the following verse, which we also got earlier on, but I'm bringing it here also because it specifically depicts the height of the age that's being spoken of here, and it quite ties in quite well with this idea of craftiness on the part of Krishna, or not only on his part, but even he's so crafty, he inspires craftiness in others. So you're really crafty when you produce that effect in others. So that verse of Rupa Goswami Pad is as follows. He says, Karna-kari saki janena vijane, duti stuti prakriya, patur vanchana chaturi. Pardon me. Patur vanchana chaturi gunanika, kunja prayane nishi. Bhādiryam guru vachi venu virutav, udkarna-teti vritan, kaishorena tavadya Krishna guruna, gauri gana patyate. So a messenger comes to Krishna and gives him the following report. Whispering ear to ear with a friend. Fine technique in praising messengers in private. Dexterity in deception of the husband. Steady practice of sneaking out to an arbor at night. Deafness to the to the speech of elders. Keeping the ears pricked at the sound of the flute. O Krishna, today, with the guru of your adolescence, fair young women, namely the gopis, are studying all these rites. So this is a play on the idea that adolescent girls traditionally would begin to learn how to perform various vratas during this age. As they're entering the marrying age, then they would learn, various other responsibilities that they would take on in the household and in the context of the society of Braja. then one of the principal duties of young women was engaging in various types of puja. As we know, Radharani her family were worshippers of Surya, and as well as after her marriage, she was regularly engaged by her mother-in-law to engage in Surya puja, to perform various vratas for the well-being of the village and her husband and her family and the cows and so on. So, customarily then, these fair young women or these gopis would meet with a village elder. In Rupa Goswami's, Natakas, we hear about Purnamasi being the elder guru who would teach some of these young women how to perform various rites and so on. So then, taking that institution, if you will, from within the culture, and saying that as the gopis would be learning these sort of traditional rites from a guru, now Krishna's adolescence has assumed the form of the guru. And the rites that they're learning are not just the conventional rites of, how to bring prosperity to your household, but now they're learning how to whisper to each other without anyone else hearing what they're saying. Now they're learning how to praise and make alliances with messengers from other groups of gopis in order to acquire advantages or information according to their interests of arranging Radha and Krishna's trysts, and how to deceive their own husbands in order to engage in all such activity. They're learning that, and they're getting regular practice at how to sneak out at night and how to move through the forest to reach designated kunjas, and how to even be reprimanded and even be instructed by their elders and hear it but still not listen, or in other words, turn a deaf ear even to the good advice that they receive, and to keep their ears pricked at the sound of the flute, or in other words, to at any moment listen very closely so that they don't miss an instant of opportunity to hear Krishna's flute and respond to its call. Krishna's adolescence is now teaching these young girls these sort of rites. So all such behavior that's mentioned here could be what you would call crafty behavior, or could be considered something that parallels this kapaṭa, or this craftiness that Krishna is described in this verse to have. So you could say Krishna is so crafty in his adolescence that even he is, able to convey or inspire such degrees of craftiness even in the women of Braja. And as we heard in the Priti Sandarbha, where Jiva Goswami elaborates on the stuti of Uddhava that he speaks in praise of the gopis after or at the end of his visit to Braja, just how dharmic the gopis were, just how sober and deep in character they were, is also very important to understand, so that the contrast between the convention of their society and what it takes, or what it would be for them to be inspired to behave the way that is described here, that also is very important to appreciate. Because if we read about this type of trickiness with reference to 21st century society and the behavior of teenage girls in today's society, well, the contrast is not as great, I'll just say, to make it, a sad understatement. So to really appreciate the depth of transformation that's alluded to in such poetry, you could say, all-conquering, all attractiveness of Krishna, that is not easy to understand, but rather requires much careful hearing and consideration of the context, the character, and so forth of the people of Braja in general, as well as the women and even more specifically the gopis. So that's also to be borne in mind, and for those who've heard that section of the Priti Sandarbha, it's also worthwhile to remember as we might laugh gleefully at hearing these things. So that's what I have on this verse. In other words, to say that if Krishna is the apogee of these waves of sweetness, of a flood of nectar, of this loveliness, that this, how lovely is this loveliness, then these poems convey that, these statements of the Bhagavat and of Rupa Goswami, that this loveliness that he exhibits in the midst of his crafty or his clever play as an adolescent is so profound that it inspires, upon instant sight by the Mathura Nagaris, readiness to undergo whatever hardship is required to experience more of it, and it inspires in the hearts of the gopis sacrifice to the nth degree, or the ultimate degree of self-abnegation. So the prayer then of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, when he says, may this Krishna appear in the hearts of the recipients of his compassion, is no small evocation, or rather, let another, or let those whom he blesses also feel that profundity of attraction. Let them be captivated, let them run, so to speak, with that degree of abandon, that degree of conviction, that degree of self-forgetfulness, and so forth. And that intensity of wonder and profundity of experience. So that Sarvabhauma makes such a prayer, that Mahaprabhu's parikaras wished that people of the future would be blessed with such a revelation in their hearts. That is, so to speak, the sustenance that we have, or we're living on that graciousness that those parikaras had in writing this type of poetry, like we have here in the case of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's poetry, and here in the case also of Rupa Goswami's collection of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's poetry and the other work of Rupa Goswami and his companions. So that they've, out of their own appreciation for this sort of wonder, written so carefully, so thoughtfully, so richly, with the hope that others might come to sincerely aspire for such experience. This is what has given us the chance to engage in the entirety of this practice, this aspiration, and this culture. So our pranams to such parikaras, to such bhaktas and their poetry. All right, so I'll come to the next verse. This is verse 91, which is another verse of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. So next, the compiler cites another of Sri Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's prayers, full of the eagerness of a bhakti rasika, in which he prays for the chance to hear the sound of Sri Krishna's flute, even if he has to perpetually undergo the hardships of birth, death, and so forth to do so. So as the Mathura Nagaris are saying, what austerity did the gopis do? Then, in a similar vein, whatever I have to undergo, that's fine, but I want this. I have such an attraction for this object that I'll pay any price. That readiness, so to speak, is a symptom of lobh, or a symptom of that intense desire, which is the entire spirit of the path of Raganuga Bhakti. So he writes as follows: Bhavantu tatra janmāni yatra te muralī-kalaḥ karṇa-peyatvam āyāti me nirvāṇa-vārtayā. Let me have births there, where the sweet sound of your flute becomes drinkable to the ears. For me, what is the use of talk of nirvana? I'll read it one more time. Let me have births there, where the sweet sound of your flute becomes drinkable to the ears. For me, what is the use of talk of nirvana? So this is obviously spoken within the 16th century context, where among scholars of Nyaya and Vedanta, whom Sarvabhauma was a most exalted example, talk of moksha, talk of nirvana was the ultimate subject of discussion, the ultimate matter of interest, considered the most refined and ultimate ideal of human life. So to say, what good is talking about nirvana? And not only that, I don't even want nirvana. I'm ready to be born again and again and again if I can hear Krishna's flute. This is, so to speak, turning a confident deaf ear to what is otherwise considered highly cultured discussion, and on top of that, illustrating or conveying something of the great attractiveness and the great spiritual blissfulness of the sound of Krishna's flute, and thereby the whole of Krishna Lila and darshan of Krishna and the madhurya of Krishna and so forth. So this is, like all of the statements we have here of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, quite a bold remark. So we'll look at some of the siddhānta that surrounds this line of thought. Repeatedly throughout Srimad Bhagavatam, it is explained that the bliss that can be experienced in nirvana, that is, in immersion in Brahman, or Brahma Sayujya Mukti, is included in and far surpassed by the bliss experienced in bhakti to Sri Bhagavan, and in perception of Sri Bhagavan's sweetness by means of bhakti to him. For instance, Sri Prahlad Maharaj teaches the following in the 7th canto. He says, the wise know the impure mind's contact with adhoksaja, that is Bhagavan, to be destructive of the cycle of samsara for an embodied being in this world, and to be inclusive of the bliss of immersion in Brahman, or nirvana. Therefore, you all should worship the Lord of the heart in the heart. So Sarvabhauma is saying, I'm not interested in nirvana, I just want to hear the sound of Krishna's flute. And here Prahlad Maharaj is saying that the impure mind's, quote, contact with adhoksaja, or in other words, perception of adhoksaja for a being in this world is inclusive of the bliss or of nirvana. So here we have the Bhagavatam itself saying, if you were to hear Krishna's flute, or you were to have darshan of Krishna, then all the bliss that you would experience in nirvana, that and more, you'll experience in that darshan, or in that hearing of the flute song by extension. So this verse is apt in this context because it directly instantiates the point that Sarvabhauma makes. So I've got Chakravarti Pad's Tika on this verse, where he adds some further detail, which is also insightful. So he gives the context of Prahlad Maharaj's statement as follows. So someone objects, here Prahlad is speaking to the other sons of the Daityas as a young boy. So someone objects to his previous statement, saying, well, it is well known that the bliss of nirvana in Brahman is verily the highest of all aims of embodied beings. So Prahlad had said something previously pointing to the opposite, and someone saying, but everybody knows nirvana is the greatest bliss, nirvana is the greatest object that anyone could achieve, moksha, nirvana, this is the purushartha. So to that it is said, true. Yet, that too is indeed included in the bliss of connection with Adhoksaja, that is Bhagavan. Sure, nirvana is the greatest bliss. It's the highest aim, but that also is encompassed in what I'm talking about. Thus, Prahlad Maharaj says that the wise know contact with Adhoksaja, that is, slight touch with the mind, or direct attainment of Adhoksaja, to be destructive of the cycle of samsara. That itself is also the bliss of immersion or nirvana in Brahman. Because of Adhoksaja himself being Brahman, an experience of the sweetness of his feet being a form of the bliss of immersion, or nirvana, on account of that experiences being a form of the highest bliss. So, pleasure absorbs the mind. So, when you experience the madhurya of Krishna, there's no doubt that your mind will become absorbed, or that your mind will become immersed. So, whatever immersion or whatever bliss of immersion that can be had in Brahmananda, that and more happens in what Jiva Gosvami elsewhere calls Bhakti-ananda, or in Madhurya Ashadan, or this relishing of Krishna's Madhurya. In this regard, the bliss that arises, so now here Chakravarti Pad adds a little bit of subtlety, looking at not just Bhagavat Darshan in general, but then further elements of the attunement of the perceiver, or the psyche of the bhakta, that add to the depth of immersion, or add to the depth of blissfulness of that. So he says the following: in this regard, the bliss that arises from a special form of myness, or mamata. So remember the definition of prema in the Sindhu. Rupa Goswami describes prema as that which is mamata-tishayankita, or marked by or characterized by intense mamata, this sense of myness, or this sense that it is held most dear and as to be as though one's own. So, the bliss that arises from a special form of mamata, on account of its being a bhava of servitude or otherwise, that is, or sakya vatsalya or madhura, in regard to him, is verily more intense, that is boundless, than the bliss of immersion in unqualified nirvishesh Brahman. So what he's saying is that Bhagavan is the Paratattva, Brahman is also the Paratattva, two different manifestations of the Paratattva. But one is perceived with mamata, one is perceived without mamata. And when Bhagavan is perceived with mamata, then the blissfulness is far greater. As the bliss arising from mamata, so now he gives a worldly example, which is also nice. As the bliss arising from mamata that can occur at the sight of even one's own crippled, blind, and deaf son, who is unpleasant to look at for all people in general, is 1,000,000,000 of times greater than the natural bliss that can occur when the moon, which is pleasant to all people and in general a cause of great delight, is seen. So this is his analogy. In other words, it's nice to see the full moon on a bright full moon night, on a clear night in the sky. This is a beautiful sight. It's serene, it's calming, it's aesthetically pleasing, or what have you. So that's a sort of pleasure that anyone can have of an object which is in general pleasurable. But he's saying that the moon is not a deep object of mamata. The moon is a very distant object. It's not something that anyone has a great sense of mamata towards. Whereas a son or another relative or another companion, a person with whom we have one of the most intimate relationships that we can have within human life, then by virtue of that mamata, then the sight of that person becomes highly relishable, highly desirable, even if the actual characteristics of the appearance of the object of mamata are not all that significant or are not all that worthy of mention. Or here he's going to the extreme and saying, even if they're highly undesirable, or even if they are the opposite of what is generally considered pleasing to look at or pleasing to see, that, as this is actually something we happened to be talking about earlier today, there's an analysis of Vallabhacharya where he talks about the prameya ball and the pramatri ball, or the power of the observer upon the object of perception in what ultimately amounts to the quality of their experience in perception, and in comparison to the power of the object being perceived. So the object being perceived has a certain influence on the quality of experience, or what it's like to perceive the object. But the attunement of the perceiver also has an effect on that. So here, what Chakravarti Pad is pointing at is that the attunement of the perceiver, or the what they call the pramatri ball, can actually be even greater than the prameya ball, or than the power, or what Jiva Gosvami elsewhere calls the bastu shakti, or the inherent potency of an object. So in the case of fire, it's going to burn you whether you love it or you hate it, or you believe it or you don't believe it. There's some cases where the power of the object is predominant. But there's other cases or other contexts in which the power of the perceiver is more significant than the power of the object. So here, this is what Chakravarti Pad is trying to bring out, and saying that when the particular attuning characteristic called mamata, or this sense of being this sense of being held dear, or of fondness and of loving attachment, that is such a powerful force that it can actually completely or effectively entirely eclipse the relative strength or the relative quality of the object of perception, such that even a sun who may not be wonderful to look at, or may not be the type of sun that anyone would hope to have, nevertheless, when that mamata is felt for that sun, then that sun is felt to be truly so pleasing to see, or one experiences such satisfaction in seeing them. So Chakravarti Pad is using this, reference to worldly experience to make this point about how the paratattva is perceived, or the significance of perceiving Bhagavan with mamata. So he says, so when one is possessed of a bhava such as servitude in relation to Bhagavan, who is Parabrahman, there occurs the apogee of the highest bliss, which arises verily from the essential nature of Bhagavan. That is, there occurs far greater bliss than one experiences if one perceives Parabrahman without any specific bhava of servitude, friendship, or otherwise in relation to him. And if that bhava of servitude, friendship, or otherwise shall also arise from mamata, specifically in relation to him, then what is to be said? That superlative greatness is the excellence of the fortune of being forced to fall into the midst of the impact of waves of many thousands of oceans of bliss. So it sounds a little stilted in English, but you get the idea. So what he's saying is, he's making a sub-distinction between bhava and bhava enriched with mamata. So as Rupa Goswami, in distinguishing bhava from prema in the Sindhu, adds that prema is mamat atishayankita, or marked by intense or profusely marked by mamata, then he's saying that greater than perceiving Parabrahman without any bhava is perceiving him with a bhava. But greater than that is perceiving him with a bhava that itself is imbued with intense mamata. And that will lead to the most profound experience, which is comparable to so many waves of bliss and so on. So he cites another verse in the Bhagavatam in this reference. O Lord, that bliss which can arise for embodied beings from meditation upon your lotus feet, or through hearing narratives of persons who are your own, does not occur even in realization of Brahman, your own all-pervading greatness. How then could it occur for the devas of Svarga, those who all eventually fall from airplanes slashed by the sword of death? Some nice, vivid, classical imagery here. Devas sitting on clouds, drinking amrita, and then this sword of death slashing them out of their pleasures. So, how would such persons, in the midst of even such things, ever experience such a bliss? And elsewhere, Rupa Goswami's well-known statement, the kind of ultimate hammer, the ultimate contrast in this regard, where he says, Brahmanando bhavadesha chetparad gunikrita naiti bhakti sukam budhe paramānutulam-api. If this bliss of Brahman, that is the bliss of the experience of Brahman, were accumulated for a prarardha, half of the lifespan of Brahma, or 50 quadrillion years, it would still not be equal to even an infinitesimal droplet of the ocean of the joy of bhakti. That's about as hard of a contrast as you can draw. So, Chakravarti Pad's purpose in citing these statements is to say that superior to the experience of nirvana, or included in the experience of Bhagavan, is the bliss of nirvana, and far more. This is what Prahlad Maharaj has to say, and this is how he explains it. So, referring back to our verse, when Sarvabhauma is saying, what is the use of talking about nirvana? This is why, because whatever you could get in nirvana doesn't equal a drop of what you would otherwise get in 50 quadrillion years. So if you want to save yourself, 50 quadrillion years, an infinity of times again and again throughout eternity, then you might consider it not worth your time to pursue that. That would be the crunch application of such analysis. So, when the bliss that can be experienced in nirvana pales in comparison to the bliss that can be experienced by relishing the sweetness of Sri Bhagavan by means of bhakti, then the bliss the bliss experienced in nirvana all the more pales in comparison to the bliss of relishing what the compiler classifies as one of the 4 super excellent sweetnesses of the form of Sri Bhagavan, replete with the apogee of aesthetic excellence, Sri Krishna of Gokula, even in comparison to all other forms of Sri Bhagavan, namely the sweetness of Sri Krishna's flute, which the compiler cites the following verses to illustrate in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So here I'm dropping a kaimutya nyai. In other words, if Chakravarti Pad and this statement in the Sindhu refer to the bliss of bhakti in general, that any type of bhakti to any form of Bhagavan is that much greater than nirvana. Okay, then if you have experience of one of the most excellent forms of the sweetness of the most excellent form of Bhagavan, then you've got further orders of magnitude in how efficient in time you'll be by taking up the path of Krishna Bhakti rather than spending it talking about nirvana, if we apply it to the way the Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya is speaking. So in other words, when he says, I don't want to talk about nirvana because I'd rather hear the flute, then he's not just speaking about the beauty or the bliss of bhakti in general, but he's talking about experiencing what Rupa Goswami calls one of the four most special types of sweetness that is found in Krishna's most excellent Leela, at his most excellent age, in his most excellent Dham, etc., etc. So now I've got some verses that otherwise describe Krishna's flute playing. So in the previous verse, as well as this one, we're developing discussion of the play of Krishna's flute. So I may go a little over time. I hope no one objects, but I think it would be nice to complete the discussion. So first, we've got a verse from I believe it's the Yugal Gita. Yes. So I'll just read the translation. The Braja Gopis, they say, O Mother Yashoda, when your son, who is adept in the various arts of cowherding and extensively self-taught in playing the flute, and sorry, I'll just drop one comment here. So I forget if it's Chakravartipad or Jiva Goswami, but they explain the way, why did the gopis call him self-taught? Sometimes when we speak of someone self-taught, it means they're not really that good, and they would have done better. People who are taught by a guru are better off than people who are self-taught. But that's not what the gopis are trying to say. They're describing him as self-taught in the sense that he's a virtuoso that's so good, he's gone above and beyond even what any guru could teach him. That's the import of him being self-taught. So saying extensively self-taught in playing the flute means he is a virtuoso at the flute that's beyond what anyone else can even, come close to playing. So just because we're on flute glorification here, then that's worth adding, I think. So they say, Yashoda, when your son, who is adept in the various arts of cowherding and extensively self-taught in playing the flute, places the flute on his bimba lips and sends forth notes and rhythmic patterns, then, upon hearing that along with its various pitches, the learned lords of the Suras, led by Indra, Shiva, and Brahma, become confused, uncertain of its nature, and bow their shoulders and minds. In other words, they're just sitting going, what is this? So this is in the Yugal Gita, in the Bhagavatam itself. And then we also have a verse of Rupa Goswami, which is cited, which he cites at the time of his meeting with Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya and others in Puri when his poetry is examined in front of Mahaprabhu and Rai Ramananda. So that verse is as follows. This one's also, I'll have to read this one. This one's also nice. Rundanam bubaritas chamat kriti param kurvan muhurtum burum dhyanarantarayan sanandam mukan vismapayan vedasam otsu kavali bhir balim chatulayan bhogindrama ghurnayan bindananda kataha bhitimabito Brahma Bangshi Dwani. Stopping the clouds, repeatedly astonishing Tumburu, meaning one of the best Gandharva musicians of Svarga, pulling Sananda and company, meaning the four Kumaras, out of meditation, as described in the third canto, astounding Brahma, exciting Bali with eagerness, causing the king of serpents, namely Anantashesh, to whirl, and piercing through the wall of the universe's shell. The sound of the flute roved all about. So, stopping the clouds, in other words, exerting a great influence over the visible sky or the immediate sky. Astonishing tumburu means reverberating into Svarga, stopping all the celestial musicians playing there and impressing them. Pulling Sananda out of meditation means going up to Tapaloka and distracting the rishis who are meditating there. Astounding Brahma, going all the way up to the highest loka, Brahmaloka, amazing him. And not just going up, but exciting Bali with eagernesses means also going down to Sutala, the third lower tala, and attracting the attention of Bali Maharaj. And not only that, causing the king of serpents, Anantashesh, who is where? At the very base of the universe, who's said to hold up all these lokas on his heads. So even causing him to spin means putting all these lokas on the tilt-a-whirl, so to speak, and then piercing out of this shell of this Brahmanda. The sound of the flute roved all about. In other words, it definitely went everywhere. Not just here, there, but up, down, everywhere. It cast its wonderful effect. So this is a very charming way of depicting the reverberations, if you will, of Krishna's flute. So, oh gosh, maybe I'll have to stop. But I've got some extra verses on this topic. In the Ujjal Nilamani, in the section on the Alambana Vibhava of Ujjal Rasa, namely Krishna, or where Krishna's qualities are surveyed there, then again his flute playing is mentioned. And when Vishnu Das Goswami, who's a disciple of Krishna's Kaviraj Goswami, in his commentary on the Ujjal Nilamani, when he comes to that quality of Krishna, Jiva Goswami, Vishnu Chakravarti, they comment on the text itself, but they don't cite examples from other works to illustrate the quality. So Vishnu Das Goswami, he comes along and he adds some illustrations. So he collects 3, 4, he quotes both the 2 verses that I quoted earlier, and he quotes a few verses from the Stavamala of Rupa Goswami, specifically the Govinda Virudavali, where there's the poetry is quite thick, or in other words, Rupa Goswami used some complicated means of composition to say things in a way which incorporates a lot of wordplay and sophistry from a compositional perspective. So these verses are also very nice in praising Krishna's flute song. So, in other words, praising this object that Sarvabhauma wants to hear, even he's ready to be born again and again if he can hear this. But I think I'll stop here, not to go over time. Don't want to rush it. So we can pick up next time with the rest of this glorification of hearing Krishna's flute, and then proceed further into this section on prayers full of eagerness. So Sarvabhauma has so much eagerness to hear Krishna's flute, he's ready to be born again. And he prays that everyone can have a revelation of Krishna within their heart. So these are the 2 main points that we discussed today. So I'll stop here. If anyone has any comment, question, correction, or feedback of any other type, feel free to share. No? All right. Well then, I'll conclude here for today. And if we're so blessed, then we'll continue again next week with further discussion of Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad's Padyavali. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Thank you.